The sun hung low and merciless above the desert plains, painting the land in hues of copper and blood as the wind whispered across the sand like the sigh of a dying world. A lone rider cut a narrow path across that endless sea of dust, his silhouette sharp against the horizon, his horse moving with the weariness of many miles behind it. He was a man of shadows, a drifter whose name had long been forgotten by townsfolk, who once feared his steady hand and the echo of his revolver. Dust clung to the brim of his wide hat and to the coarse lines of his face, carved deep with the passage of time and battles he never asked for, but could never avoid. His coat was long, torn at the edges, carrying the scars of bullets and the stains of a life lived too close to the grave. He had come this way chasing no bounty, no gold, no revenge, only the silence of the desert, a silence that promised to swallow up the noise of his past. Yet even silence, he was about to learn, has its monsters. As he rode further, the land began to shift. The bones of cattle lay half buried in the sand, their ribs jutting toward the sky like broken prayer sticks. Vultures circled lazily overhead, too bloated to bother with his passing. The earth bore strange markings, long furrows carved into the dirt as though something vast and heavy had dragged itself across the desert floor. The rider slowed his horse, eyes narrowing beneath the shadow of his hat, his hand unconsciously brushing the worn grip of his revolver. He had seen many signs of death in his life, but these trails were different. They did not speak of wolves or coyotes, or any beast that belonged to these lands. These trails whispered of something alien, something that had no right to be here. His horse snorted nervously, its ears twitching as though it too felt the unnatural presence that lingered in the air. The rider patted its neck, his voice low and steady like a man whispering against the storm. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though deep inside he felt the stirrings of unease. He had heard stories in the saloons, the kind that men told after too much whiskey, about a serpent that came from the jungles far south of the border, a beast carried by rivers and storms until it found its way to these barren lands. They called it El Diablo de Escamas, the devil of scales. Most laughed at such tales, but the rider knew enough of the world to understand that legends were often born from truth. The first shot rang out like thunder rolling across the canyon, echoing through the barren cliffs as the rider's revolver spat fire at the impossible beast before him. The serpent of nightmares that had risen from the earth, as though the desert itself had given birth to a demon. The bullet struck true, embedding into the thick scales of the Anaconda, but the effect was nothing more than a spark against a mountain of muscle. The creature's body rippled like liquid steel, its hiss a sound so low and vast it seemed to vibrate in the rider's bones. Dust whirled in a storm around them as the horse reared, eyes rolling in terror. But the man leapt from the saddle, landing hard and steady, his boots sinking into the sand as he leveled his gun again. He fired once, twice, 3 times, each shot hitting the beast's coiled mass. Yet the serpent surged forward, undeterred, its head lashing down with the speed of a striking whip. The man rolled, the heat of the sand biting into his skin through his coat, and came up on one knee, firing point blank into the cavernous mouth of the snake. For a heartbeat, it seemed the monster faltered, its body twisting in agony, but then it lunged again, the impact throwing the rider against a jagged outcrop of stone. The wind was knocked from his lungs, pain flaring through his ribs, but his spirit did not break. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself upright, spitting blood into the dust, his eyes burning with the stubborn fire that had carried him through 100 battles. Come on, then," he growled, voice raw, his revolver raised with trembling defiance. The serpent answered not with words but movement, its massive coils surging like living rivers, encircling him with relentless force. The rider fought like a cornered wolf, slashing with his knife now that his bullets were spent, carving into the glistening flesh of the beast. But for every wound he made, the serpent tightened, crushing him with the weight of a mountain. His breath came ragged, each gasp harder than the last, yet his mind refused to surrender. Flashes of memory lit his fading vision. His mother's soft voice, singing under the stars, the laughter of a woman he once loved but left behind, the screams of men he had bested in duels, where hesitation meant death. He thought of freedom, of redemption, of the desert wind carrying his soul beyond the reach of pain. But the serpent, merciless and eternal, gave him no reprieve. With a final, suffocating constriction, the rider felt his bones creak like timber in a storm, his body breaking under the sheer pressure. Yet even as the world went dark, his eyes locked on the horizon, unyielding, defiant to the last breath. The great serpent's jaws opened wide, swallowing him into the abyss, a legend devouring a man who had himself once been a legend. And when the battle ended, silence returned to the desert, broken only by the distant cry of vultures and the shifting of sand over the serpent's massive body as it slid back into the earth, leaving behind no trace but the echo of a struggle that defied the boundaries of nature itself. The desert did not weep, nor did it mourn. It simply stretched on in its eternal silence, the sun burning the land as if nothing had happened, as if a man had not stood against a beast born from nightmare and lost his life in the dust. Days passed before the first travelers stumbled upon the place, a pair of prospectors searching for veins of silver who found instead the remains of a horse, its body torn and crushed beyond recognition, its eyes still wide with the terror it had seen. Around it, the ground bore strange impressions, deep grooves and coiled trails far larger than any rattler or python these men had ever heard of, marks that told of a struggle too immense to comprehend. One of the men swore he felt the earth tremble beneath his boots as though something vast still slumbered beneath the sand. And when he bent low to trace the markings with his hand, he pulled back in fear, whispering the name of the rider he believed had come this way. A gunslinger known only by rumor and by the trail of duels he had left behind. Word spread quickly, faster than desert fire on a windy day. In saloons from El Paso to Tucson, men raised their mugs of whiskey and spoke in hushed voices about the drifter who had faced the devil snake of the desert, who had emptied his revolver and carved with his blade until breath and strength abandoned him. Some swore they had seen the serpent themselves, its scales glistening like molten bronze beneath the sun, its body stretching longer than a train, sliding through canyons and dry riverbeds as though the land itself was its hunting ground. Others called it nonsense, drunken tales spun for coin and laughter, but when they laughed their eyes betrayed unease, for deep down every man knows the desert keeps secrets too vast and terrible for the mind to hold. Soon the rider's story was no longer just a story. It became a legend, a warning carried by cowboys and wanderers who rode too far from the beaten trails. Beware the devil of scales, they would mutter around their campfires, the flames flickering shadows across their weary faces, for it swallowed a man whole, a man braver than any of us. And children who grew up on the edge of the frontier would lie awake at night listening to their fathers tell of the duel between man and serpent, wide-eyed with wonder and fear, their imaginations painting the scene of dust and blood and thunder under the setting sun.